Hi, I'm Rigger. This is Your Right, and I swore I would never do this. Before we get started, be sure to like the video if you like it, share if you think others would like it, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and subscribe if you want to see more. Now, unfortunately, before we begin, and I hate to do this, I have to start out this video on a down note, because before we proceed, we have to have a little chat. It's true, I said I would never cover this topic, because the shipping community in RWBY has been very destructive in the past. It's ruined people's enjoyment of the show, it's driven creators and fans away, it's a very, very dangerous thing to talk about, which is why I'm not. I want to put this here. This is not a video about ships and the way, you would like these people to be together. That's on you. If you like them, that's fine. That's not the way I'm thinking of them here. Yes, part of this video will look into who RWBY could fall in love with and why not, but I'm actually here to talk about the characters and their arcs, etc. If you like the idea of RWBY being one person or another, that's totally fine, and I'm not telling you you're wrong or to stop, and I'm no authority on the topic at all. It's not my show. But relationships in general are a very powerful and key part of storytelling, so I want to examine our main character and that element. But also, I want to say this right now, very seriously. I will be monitoring the comments on this video more than any others. If they get out of hand, I will not hesitate to ban people from commenting, and I am very willing to just turn the comments off on this one if need be. Please be civil to each other, because then we can all just enjoy and discuss. That's all it is. With all of that hopefully understood, now we can proceed. So there's a reason I am covering this now, despite saying I never would. And that's because as we travel into volume 9 and 10, and where we are in the story, the eventual endgame is somewhere approaching on the horizon, like we're moving towards that part of the story. And when that happens, we should start thinking and considering endings and what we want for our characters. And a big part of that could be relationships, because that's important to everyone's lives. So in this, we're going to look at if they're going to set up a relationship for RWBY, 1, should they at all, and 2, if so, with who? Because as we move towards the end of the series, we might look at what we want RWBY's future to be. I decided to focus on RWBY specifically because despite it being a broadcast, she is still the main character. She's our introduction character, she was our window into this world, and she's who we mostly follow. And since she was our window in, there's a good chance that she will be our window out. And as a main character, that ending could go any number of ways, and at the moment, none are sure. Is she gonna fall in love and live happily ever after, like the fairy tales we've sort of been, referencing forever? Maybe have a family. Is she gonna die to save the world, sacrificing herself, and, that's how everything comes around to be? Is she gonna continue on some next quest? We end with her going on her next big adventure, and that sort of leaves you with the idea that there's a future beyond the end of the story. And, does she need to end up in a relationship, or does she go it alone, or does she stick with her friends? All are possible, and so are other options too. The spectrum is very broad. So no, before you ask, I don't plan on doing this for other characters, at least not that I can see a reason to right now. Just specifically here I'm interested in RWBY because as the main character, a lot of people criticize RWBY because she has main character syndrome, where she's not totally interesting really. She doesn't evolve a whole lot. She only has little moments because despite being what you'd think the main focus should be, she doesn't serve that role. She keeps the story moving forward. She keeps the team together, she keeps ideas running, she leads missions, she interacts with the big boss. That's sort of how it goes, and every now and then she gets a little character moment. She keeps the ensemble of more crazy and colourful characters moving forward, and that is an important role. And in her time fulfilling that role, she really hasn't had any sort of romantic subplot that's actually really reared up. So the idea of does this even need to happen at all for RWBY is very valid. So all of that is what we're going over in this video. See, a big part of this actually comes down to theming. See, RWBY as a character has displayed very little in terms of actions or dialogue that really suggests she's overly interested in being in a romantic relationship with anybody, which is also fine. She may, as a character, be entirely uninterested in the concept, or in fact, it just hasn't entered her mind at all as something to even be concerned about because she has bigger issues like saving the entire world to worry about and doesn't have time for those sort of thoughts. If it is the case that she's compartmentalized her feelings or pursuits romantically until there's time for it to happen, is absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that approach, and in fact, I kinda like it as a sign of maturity in RWBY, but also as a sign of stunted growth at the same time. That she would feel a need to do that, which is sad because she's in this world-ending situation which she shouldn't be placed in because nobody should. But also, you could just say she isn't interested as a person, and that is also fine. You could say that she's just pretty asexual, and even more than that, finds comfort in relationships and companionships with her friends and her family, but isn't just much of a romantic either. So the idea of sort of a romantic companion just didn't really come up to her mind. It's just not something she's interested in at kind of a core level. that would actually be pretty interesting for a character like that, because it's pretty rare to have someone openly talk about those feelings. If ever it gets brought up, say with Yang, in discussions with her sister about her blossoming relationship with Blake, and RWBY just says that she's not really interested in all that, she doesn't really have those feelings, and they can take advantage of having a pretty unique main character, because it's just pretty rare to see a pretty non-romantic, asexual main character. So if they want to take advantage of that, they easily could. But also, like I mentioned, I think you could also tell a really interesting story if you discover that she does have those feelings and those urges, but she's locked them away to keep focus on keeping her friends alive and everyone moving forward and saving the world, being the leader and defeating Salem. Then if she achieves that goal, like end of story, Salem dies or whatever happens and the world is saved, then she suddenly is a little directionless, and we end where she decides that that's her next adventure, to find out who she really is, without the mission to save the world in front of her. The indulgence of her wants and feelings, and go out and discover herself, something she never had the opportunity to do before. And you could even end it there, the series closing on the various characters having their various endings, and RWBY heads back into the world to find out what the rest of her life is and who she really is and what the rest of life holds for her and her wants. She doesn't have that crushing responsibility anymore. I think that's actually pretty good, especially as a way to address why it really hasn't come up before now, so they can cover it. If people are mad that they didn't cover it in their writing, it's like, oh, it's actually a character thing. It's her next adventure that we don't really get to see, but we know she's going on, and that makes sense for how she's acted through the story. It covers that little writing issue if people have an issue with it, and it makes a lot of sense in the situation she's in, and we leave our character knowing that they'll do more and go on more adventures. And it stops the exact thing I'm worried about with this exact video, which is it stops the shipping wars breaking out, because no one's right and no one's really wrong. Unless the other people you want them to be involved with are in a relationship, you can't say that they won't end up together. It's just a mystery. We simply won't find out, but we know she has a bright future ahead of her and more to do with her life, and we're happy for her being finally able to explore those things. We take comfort in that ending. So right away, those are some pretty interesting options to take without even delving into the relationship. But before we get to the bit I'm sure everyone is here for, let's go over RWBY as the character. Can you tell I'm putting off those other sections? Because one thing about her which works against that previous idea is that she does actually put a lot of her emotions forward. She doesn't have a lot of romantic emotions she's shown, but she does show a lot of her other emotions. She's not very stoic. She gives impassioned speeches or shows her disappointment or cries. She has crushing sadness and doesn't really hide away as much. Sure, lots of people like to say she's probably has all this pent-up rage and so forth, and maybe she does, but that's just a fan idea. But she's not a stonewall of a character. She does use her emotions and emotional connections to motivate herself and others, and we see her impacted by those feelings as well pretty consistently. Which is not me equating to locking away her romantic feelings specifically as being you have to lock away all your feelings, not at all, they're very different things, but she is quite an emotional person with lots of personal ties to other people and bonds, so the idea that she's locking away her romantic feelings actively is pretty hard to swallow in someone in her character. Because in real life, absolutely, you can be that way, but in a show, you usually sort of follow some patterns and give some indicators to people with other writing trends or how characters act to sort of give hints to the audience or justify your writing ideas to audiences because it fits the mold of who they are separately from that idea. But again, the fact that she is so emotional towards other people and a lot of the other situations but hasn't shown a lot of romantic feelings does give credence to the idea that perhaps she just isn't romantically inclined at all. So that always remains an option. The other option is that she has those feelings and those wants and either hasn't really let on with them until now, managing to hide them actively, or hasn't found a target for them yet, but may in the future. That's also why I'm addressing it now, because with it getting to later seasons, if a relationship is going to happen and develop before the end of the show, it's time to get started on it to give it some room so it feels justified. While it seems like the dominating romantic relationship of Volume 9 should probably be Yang and Blake finally, and is going to be, it's also time to sprinkle in the start of RWBY having a relationship if she's gonna have one at all, or probably next season at the latest. Either utilising the fact that she's away from the worries of Remnant for right now and has to face her own feelings and her own thoughts on this island, unsure if she'll even be able to leave again, and those feelings come up, or those feelings come up once she returns to reality and realises what she's been missing, or something like that. So now, I'm left with no choice but to examine the romantic options for RWBY, barring the idea it'll be a new unmet character that suddenly appears and she'll immediately fall for, which seems really unlikely at this point and would not be well received. So yeah, we're not doing that, or at least doing so feels like a huge mistake, so we'll go with the characters we know, because we can only talk about characters we know anyway. So yes, it's finally time to look at that playing field of characters for long-term companions who RWBY has had interactions with on screen, who could be potential love interests. There's 3 big contenders. Like, if you want to say there's a reason RWBY can fall for Sun, you're right, there absolutely is a reason. But they've only shared a few lines ever, and it's not really developed, and those interactions aren't really there for now, so it's not really useful to go into that relationship. Same for like those who want her with Blake. That's not happening, she's getting with Yang. It's not, unless something crazy happens, it's not really worth addressing for a legitimate discussion on the topic. But I'm assuming everyone knows that. Those sort of ships are there just for fun. But now we'll look at the actual 3 contenders for the spot. As far as in the show, with actual developed relationships, the 3 major players are Jaune, Weiss, and Oscar. So objectively, let's analyze her relationship with each of them, but also what actual story there could be moving forward, which is more important. Does them being in a relationship actually develop them as characters and as plot, rather than just being there to be token and just for the sake of it? Plot potential is key, because if this is a thing moving forwards, what are we getting out of it moving forwards? So, there's really no good place to start, so legitimately when I wrote this script, I rolled a dice and I got Oscar. Okay, Oscar. Well, really as far as anything resembling hints at romance happening, there's only ever been 2. When Oscar met everyone and he was staring at RWBY. Admittedly, he's never seen huntsmen and huntresses before, just like he said. Now, RWBY is the youngest and closest to his age there for sure, and he's talked about that, he wanted to do more with his life. She's an example of that, so it could just be idolizing it. Or it could be attraction. Or it could just be marveling at the scenario. Or he could just be nervous. All these things are totally readable in his reaction. So there's that interaction, and the other one was the awkward moment where they were tripping over each other, which was more heavily readable that way as they both sort of got embarrassed and flustered. But while those are the only sort of relationship tease moments, they're not the only moments the 2 have had, not by far. We also need to factor in big emotional moments, like RWBY's big talk with him, and that was a huge moment that affected Oscar and showed him the struggles someone like her faces as well, and the losses she's had yet keeps pushing on. A lot of respect and admiration and sympathy seem to spawn here for her from him. Also, RWBY leads a team, and often the group. All over the place, you see all the characters defer to RWBY a lot, which could be very influential in how he sees dealing with her, and the responsibility she's had to deal with. And he has had so much thrust upon him too, that he's trying to juggle, so he can relate. He sees someone similar to his age with all this weight on their shoulders, and he's dealing with the weight on his. Not to mention, Oscar himself has talked a lot about how having these companions, making a difference, helping people is what he dreamed of being and what he wanted to do. And RWBY is the best example to him of someone that's doing just that, who is the closest to him, and has helped him get where he is. They also share a lot of screen time. When Oscar has a problem, he brings it to RWBY. But also there's a main character syndrome there, right? Like, who else is he gonna bring it to? For the audience, the best person to bring it to is RWBY. So that's always a factor there. Never forget main character syndrome when it comes to anything involving RWBY. But also we have the ticking clock of Ozpin. A lot of people really hate this element, but because it's confronting, you can do a lot with it if we were to pursue this idea. I talked previously that you could have this big return home from the island after Volume 9 or in Volume 9, whenever they get back, and be shocked that the merge happened. You didn't get to see it happen, but the Oscar you know is basically dead, and that's huge. Either she realized her feelings while she was on the island, or simply was just happy to see anyone when they got back. It doesn't have to be romantic yet, and it's crushing, because Oscar is just gone. Or you can do it later. That RWBY does develop feelings for him, and it's tragic because we know the inevitable is coming, so you see them get together and you want them to be happy, but you know that clock is ticking down for when the merge happens and he's gone. Or even if the merge is more 50-50, it's still the person that she fell in love with isn't really there anymore. They are partially gone, they're not themselves. Then it's really crushing, because then she has to travel and work and fight with who should be the person she's in love with, but it's not really, it's Oz. And she has her happy ending seemingly stolen away from her. Then you can play with that pain and loss for a long time, and really get a lot out of the characters, before hopefully at the end they find a solution, separate them and they get to be together at the end, be it via the gods or some other means. As a character for RWBY, this provides a lot, particularly if you pair her with Jaune, also having lost who he loves and trying to help RWBY through those feelings. Whereas once Jaune was on the side of loss when RWBY saw him alone in the field, now he's trying to help her and guide her with what he's had to learn to wrestle and deal with. But it's worse for RWBY because she still has to see his face every day. She has to see Oscar every day, but it's not him. That's really heart-wrenching, and for story potential, it's really rich and you could really play off it. Also, there's a decent opportunity in Volume 9 to start it, because while she is away on the island without Oscar, one of the good ways to initially discover those feelings is to be separated. Yes, they've been separated before circumstantially, such as during the fights, but then in those moments the action never stopped. Now that they're actually split and significant time passes and they can't do anything about it, their thoughts can drift to each other and they start realizing those feelings are there. That pulls some new emotions out of them, and that makes reuniting then create the spark. Then, the ticking time bomb of Oz comes into play as they start developing those feelings together, and right as everything seems to be going great for them, the merge happens and it's ripped away. That's pretty perfect to keep the plot rolling, everyone moving forward, and the characters developing. You could say that's why include the Oz part, because it's there, and we need to address it, so hand-waving it away and pretending it's not there isn't really beneficial to this discussion, because it is there in the plot, so we need to make sure we factor it in. The only other way that they could think of a solution is a racing clock, so you get to the solution before it happens. So they're side by side, falling for each other, and they get to the thing that saves them right at the last moment, and it's saved at the last second. So it feels like a big sort of tension, but the visceral emotion and response there is a lot less. The having it ripped away where he's just gone, that's way more heart-wrenching. That's basically a character death. So that's really more impactful. It just won't feel as big the other way, but it's not saying you can't do that. But going for the far more impactful option means that the eventual reuniting when they do solve the issue is way bigger. The greater the low, the higher the highs. Looking at these relationships, what I look for is always what can develop, what between the two characters evolves because they get into a relationship. Oscar is on a journey of maturity, of massive responsibility, and trying to handle this world-ending situation that he never asked to be a part of. As a parallel with RWBY, it's pretty good, but them going on the journey together and overcoming these issues works better in this role of RWBY being almost a mentor to Oscar, who he looks up to and is his motivation to also keep going. That doesn't really need a romantic element, holding him up rather than letting him fall, and that relationship doesn't gain more weight if they're together. As always, outside of the want for just good endings for the two of them, which could be them together, it doesn't really add to the dynamic that much. The only thing that really does is the awkward Oz element, which is in place to mess with that dynamic, which it very well could do, and even more strongly if they are in a relationship. The potential for a story there is huge, but that means really digging through that subject from all angles, and that can be pretty awkward and uncomfortable. A lot of the audience has expressed they're uncomfortable with it already, and they're not even together. So while there's great potential to use it, you can also just use it to rip away her friend, and that can be just as impactful without having to be romantically interested in the person that is then occupied by Oz. People might have some very strange feelings about that. You need to decide if you want to go through that as a story. And now I think that's Oscar covered, so on to the next one. Next is Weiss. Okay, people are going to get really mad at me for this statement, but honestly, romantically inclined moments between the two are basically non-existent. They've had some sweet moments, for sure. Volume 1 with their enemies to friends story and the sweet coffee scene, etc. You can choose to read those in that way if you'd like, but the actual story they go into developing is working as a team, as the whole of Volume 1 does. Volume 1 basically exists to just speed run all the usual plot points of putting a team together and get them out of the way. Which is why, despite enemies to lovers being a very common romantic trope, it doesn't even really apply here because they were enemies for all of a few episodes, 7 volumes ago. So, as an overarching structure for romance, it doesn't really apply here if you're looking for that element. A lot of people I've seen reference stuff like the supportive RWBY with Jacques and the hugs. Sure, again, you can choose to read them that way, but they're not constructed to give that story beat. And while I think this is the most dangerous statement I'm going to make in this entire video, but it's honestly the way I feel about this, I think that pairing Weiss and RWBY would do a huge disservice to Weiss's character and the story as a whole. Before you attack me about that, let me elaborate, because I'm not saying it's bad, I'm saying that we actually get a lot more out of it if they don't. Because Weiss and RWBY together are great, but in the story, Weiss has been given so much plot. In fact, she's gotten way more plot than probably anyone else in the story on the whole team. And because of that, she's very beloved, because we've gotten to see so much of her, and we've seen such development of her character over all the volumes. But no matter how many arcs she's been on, her overarching issue always comes back to her family. It's rooted in family for her character. Her upbringing was an issue to start, her family name, her struggles, her whole situation, and after all this time, she's finally found a new family. She was paired with them, and she has strong bonds with them, and we finally get round to the family moment in Volume 7. That includes some of her old family too, with Winter and that, but if more than anything, it's the team. The support and the love of everyone on this team has changed who she is, and more than that, has supported her in a way that no one else ever had before. Yes, you can read into this moment, but honestly doing so takes away from the overall moment, because what this whole moment is so much bigger than that. Because for this moment, the entire team recognized Weiss was emotionally struggling, and they step up on both sides of her as a physical and mental support system and reassure her to keep going. Yes, RWBY and Weiss have a lot of cute moments, but reading them romantically kind of takes away from reading them as being a great example of how a character like RWBY can really change Weiss's life and her outlook without the need for any romantic element there. They would already do anything for each other and mean the world to each other. Nothing will ever change that. They will die for each other without a second thought, and they have their playful jokes and in moments that show how strong their connection is, how strong their friendship is, how strong their relationship is that they have. Adding romance to it wouldn't be hard, it's really easy, but it would take away from saying that these bonds can exist without the need for romance, that it can be more than that this is bigger than that it's not a factor in their motivation or their bond. They're the example of those ties that bind people together for life outside of romance, and that really speaks to a lot of the messages RWBY as a character says and the show RWBY talks about. People working together, setting aside their differences, what it means to be human, to have that connection. These two who were so different and pitted against each other are now linked with an unbreakable bond, something that goes beyond friendship into true family ties without being related, and they don't need romance to get there. On a storytelling level, that's just more powerful. But another point is that not pairing them also bucks away a trend, which is nice to do when you're writing a story. See, there's a big trend of all the pairs just become romantic. Jaune and Pyrrha, burgeoning romance. Nora and Ren, already existing romance. And now of course Blake and Yang, also a slow developing romance. Jaune's was explored briefly and then ripped away too soon to be tragic, and that's his own story and a plot point in the show. Nora and Ren have a long-term development that started before the events of the show even took place, and Blake and Yang are now in a developing romance that's finally coming to the forefront that seemingly didn't exist at the start but has been slowly developing. Some praise that, and some criticize the time it's taking to come to fruition, but the big thing is that they want it to feel earned. That's what they always say. So that relationship is just going to happen. It's pretty solidified. So this late in the game to then also pair RWBY and Weiss into a sudden romance also invalidates that build that Blake and Yang has been slowly earning. Whether you like it or not, that's a story they've told. So if they build all that story where they slowly have come together, but then RWBY and Weiss just get together, it then invalidates all of those emotional moments back to, oh yeah, all the pairs just get together. This is also particularly relevant because people really see Blake and Yang's relationship as important for representation. A lot of people have connections to it. A lot of people really are invested in it. So if you're factoring that in too, you really don't want to do anything that's going to retroactively make it feel less earned and less important for as far as actual plot points in the show, your fan stuff outside notwithstanding. The best reason to do the pairing that I can see is simply, again, just wanting them to be happy, which is fair enough. It's nice, but doesn't offer a whole lot of plot. If they were to enter a relationship, no matter how earned it was, nothing changes between them if they were romantically involved from where it is now. For instance, let's say you wanted to hurt the team and hurt their partner, so what you decide to do is to kill one of them, and main character syndrome means that it would have to be Weiss that dies. Now, you can say that's a bold option, but you could also achieve the same effect anyway killing Weiss right now without there being romance. It wouldn't change the reaction really. It doesn't add anything to that dynamic. If you killed Weiss right now, she'd react just as if you'd killed someone she was in love with, because they have that bond like family anyway. Therefore, for plot potential, it doesn't actually add much. I know people like to point to a lot of stuff too, like Weiss's red accessories. She's always had those, since before she knew RWBY. And having things to remind her of her best friend and partner and teammate, who she also considers family, is also pretty reasonable. So, as popular as this is, and I see why it's so popular and I have nothing against it, I really don't see this one having much to offer for the actual show and plot. All it does is potentially damage one of the other long-term relationships that's actually in the plot and in canon, which you don't want to do. So, if you were to do it, you'd have to do it very carefully, and then once it's done, it wouldn't change much. And lastly, we have Jaune. Jaune is very tricky here. Before we do the show things, I actually need to step back for a second outside of the show and address something, which is the way Jaune is viewed. See, the big thing is, if this were to happen, people will write it off as, oh, it's Miles' character. I don't think that's really fair at all here. He's been a character since the beginning, with a lot of plot towards him. So if this happened, writing it off as Miles writing himself to end up with the main character is a really flippant way of thinking about this, which isn't really fair. Because even if it's technically true, and it was written that way, it'd be from the beginning. It would be part of the long-term ending plan, and that was from way before anyone started having a problem with the character of Jaune and the outside factors involved in that. My point being, it's not an out-of-nowhere thing. If it were to happen, it would have been always the plan. So whether you hate Jaune as a character, or don't like Miles, or you think he's inserting himself in the story, that's not relevant to this discussion because it wouldn't be part of this whole plan. It would have been there from the start. So now let's actually look at the idea from within the plot again. And I say all that because honestly, and I have no bias towards any of these picks, I'm just looking at them from plot, this is kinda the best one. He's the best pick if you're building a happy ending with no big crushing twists at least to affect the characters. Which you might say is a down, but as far as a really good pick, Jaune is a seriously good pick from within the plot. The emotionally twisting thing with Oscar is really interesting, but it would also dominate the story. It'd tear apart RWBY and, rip her emotions apart while we're still on the road to dealing with Salem. So while that's good for RWBY and could be very interesting, it would derail the whole plot, which might be something you don't want to do. But as far as a story to run alongside with RWBY, to build a relationship on the travel together and what you can get out of it for both characters, I think Jaune has the most potential for a long-term developed relationship starting now. To start with, it's very long term. It actually would feel earned if those feelings started to awaken, and you could have quite a good slow build that comes to light and really helps with Jaune as a whole for his character arc. Because he's not finished yet. Just like Weiss, there haven't been a whole lot of romantic moments between the two, that's absolutely correct. However, unlike Weiss, they're not on a team, they're not always together, and there is a development that still has a very natural way to evolve without undercutting anyone else's relationship. Whereas Weiss's big hugs and moments have all been about reuniting like family, Jaune and RWBY's connection has always been about them holding each other up and helping when they're needed. It happens all over the place constantly, from Jaune picking her up the very first time on the first day they met, RWBY picking Jaune up in the locker room after embarrassing himself without judging him. RWBY, after learning her early lesson, then counsels Jaune to pick him back up, to tell him to handle his responsibility as a leader with words of encouragement. Then Jaune's concern for RWBY's missed call that leads into them heading into helping RWBY's team at the end of Volume 2. RWBY stepping up to lead Jaune and his team after Pyrrha's death when Jaune was at his lowest, and Jaune then talking to her about giving them all the courage to do this, to follow her. Jaune deferring to RWBY's plan on the train and trusting her. His concern and relief for her returning again. RWBY being the only person who can cut through Jaune's anger and who he listens to when he's flown off the handle. Then RWBY wanting to hear Jaune's plan and trusting in Jaune's plan. Over and over they have these interactions which aren't romantically fueled, but they are there and consistent. And they have a lot of cute moments together too, like their lines by the punch bowl, their talk in the blacksmiths, their reaction after the Aesop's mission, etc. It is similar to the Weiss relationship on paper, but what's different is what they get out of it if it were to happen. Weiss gets her family, but she has that already. RWBY gets her teammates, she has that already. But Jaune gets someone who supports and believes in him in a way that others haven't, at least in the past. Obviously his team believes in him now. But RWBY not only gets her first friend, but someone she can share her struggles with who specifically isn't in her family, quote unquote. They share so much in common. They're both leaders of their teams, and both of whom were underdogs to be the leaders of those teams. RWBY because of her age and Jaune because of his battle skill. They have really neat parallels when it comes to leading their own teams and developing as huntsmen. And because they're not consistently together, they have this reoccurring theme of meeting over and over again for their talks, coming together and relying on each other without it being a constant. But honestly, all of that is surface. It's still very similar to what I said about Weiss, but what's more is the story potential, because it's really big here. The reason I bring this up now is, again, on the island, Jaune is along for the ride, and while Blake and Yang will surely dominate on that side of interactions for romance and stuff, it's a good time to open up this idea if they want to do it. This is pretty much the last chance, because now, once again, after 2 volumes of working together but not really being together on screen a whole lot, Jaune and RWBY have ended up coming back together and away from the wider issues of the world. And also away from the huge cast, it's just a small group on the island. So really, this is that last chance. If they want some separation from the Salem plot, to start this kind of development, now is the only real time I can think of before the end probably comes up. RWBY and Jaune can have another one of these moments, these talks, or a struggle, and away from the horrors of Remnant, perhaps realize there's something there that they want. Because like I've said through this whole video, what's important is what they get out of it. Emotionally, we know that a big point for Jaune will always be Pyrrha. After visiting her statue, she hasn't really come up much, but it will always be there. People have talked about seeing her spirit here and all kinds of this and that. Maybe, maybe not. But for Jaune, what a relationship with RWBY would do is continue down the path of acceptance after loss. Let's be mature here for a second. You could do something really good with this as a message and as a story. Because we are saying that because Jaune lost Pyrrha, he should never be in a relationship again? That's very wrong and very weird. It's pretty horrible to do so. And a way to combat that is actually have him maturely face the idea of another relationship. It's a hard thing to face, but Jaune going through the process of acceptance and moving on can be helped with the realization that it's also what Pyrrha would want for him. She wouldn't want him to close off his life, to never be happy, to feel love and connection again because she was gone. And feeling those things wouldn't be a disservice to her or somehow mean he doesn't still love her too forever. And if there's anyone that works for, it's with RWBY. If you were to do this with another random character who just showed up to pair him off with, it might feel very disrespectful to Pyrrha because we don't know this person, but with RWBY it's really long term and it's really earned. There just isn't another good candidate for a relationship for Jaune so he can learn this lesson and face this idea, and there's no one else he's really close to who he could open up to about this feeling except RWBY, especially now that he's been separated from the rest of his team. It's in fact a perfect topic for one of their staple talks. To air all this out, Jaune having all these feelings and ideas about what to do, how to move on from Pyrrha, and if he even should, or if he's even allowed to. RWBY is the person Jaune always confides in with these real issues. While I said this isn't about sending a message, theming is still important, and a really good way to address that for someone like Jaune is the stages of grief. He's had that rage, and that hate for Cinder, and that pain, and that loss, and that suffering for Pyrrha. But when does it end? Not that he shouldn't still want revenge and to kill Cinder, but still you could actually address this idea of someone allowing themselves to feel those things again. To feel love for someone else romantically isn't wrong. It's not bad or a betrayal. But similarly, if anyone is going to understand where Jaune is coming from, it's going to be RWBY. She's going to understand that he'll always have those feelings for Pyrrha. It's RWBY who's been out on this whole journey with him. She would get it. She can pull him out of that darkness and know that she's not just some replacement for Pyrrha. And we won't feel that way with all of their history together. RWBY equally has someone to open up to. Not that she doesn't have already with her team, but specifically someone outside of her team, who she can be different with, a different kind of emotionally close with, someone who she's always talked to. It's someone she can talk with about everything that's emotionally weighing her down that she may not want to reveal to her teammates, that as another leader, Jaune can understand that, and it's a different dynamic than if she were to start a relationship with someone that's in her team, say with Weiss. A new person to talk about stuff like her mother's fate, the responsibility that's on her head, all of it. And someone like Jaune, who again is a leader with his own team and who also doesn't feel prepared most of the time, would definitely understand. He's someone who can sympathize with those feelings of being asked to do more than you think you're capable of and living up to a legacy that you're not sure you can. I think you could really do a world of good there with Jaune's character even more than RWBY's, and naturally open up those feelings in a way that would feel real from two people who've known each other for so long. It would, for lack of a better term, also feel earned, but simply through a separate route than the one of the developing relationship for, say, Yang and Blake. It's just a different path to get there. It also sets up RWBY with a new thing to lose, which again, killing Jaune anyway, she would take horribly right now. But it's a new angle to it, and you might believe that's going to happen more than something like with Weiss. As much as Weiss getting stabbed emotionally hurt, you didn't buy it was going to happen. If it was Jaune, you might be able to buy it. Or at least a little bit more. Plus, it sets up really interesting ideas towards the end of the plot. Like, RWBY goes to sacrifice herself to save the world, and Jaune has to wrestle with the idea of losing a second person he loves. Or the other way, and Jaune makes the sacrifice just like Pyrrha did, and RWBY has to realize that she's going to go through what Jaune went through. But it's the right thing to do in this moment. Or, again, you can just set up with them living happily ever after. You know, it's a decent little love story that they end up together at the end, going full circle from the beginning of the story. there's a lot you could play with. Honestly, the big negatives against doing this story really come back to how you handle the Pyrrha stuff. If you handle it right, it could be amazing. If you handle it wrong, it could feel very manipulative and or very disrespectful. So you just got to make sure you talk through all those emotions and feelings. Plus, you also need to make sure that in some way you still take it somewhat slow. Having them spend more time together, perhaps on the island separated from the others if they just find each other, that's a big step forward. And they can have big heart-to-heart talks, which helps compensate for not having a slow build of multiple moments, but reminds you of all the moments they've had before. You know, they don't have the floaty moments Blake and Yang have had, but it feels natural like friends. And then if there is a kiss, don't make it huge, honestly. Don't make it a giant momentous occasion that it feels like the Blake and Yang kiss will eventually be. Instead of that big swell of music and amazing moment framed perfectly, make it small and understated. Just sitting with each other and it just sort of happens. It feels very natural and more real, and that is its own kind of earned. And they probably don't fall for each other immediately right away after it. They have to think about what they feel and think about if that's right and talk it out and come to terms with it by the end of that little arc. That's pretty perfect. Like I said, the only other big negative is simply the reaction a certain part of the audience will give. And also, it's kind of cliche to do since people pick Jaune as the default love interest, obviously at the start of the story, but honestly, it's gone so far past that, like the story has been going for so long, that it doesn't really feel like that cliche anymore, because it's sort of completely dropped out of things, and doing it now is such a long build that it feels more earned rather than just using it as a cliche anyway. So, I don't think we're playing into that trope at this point. And now, finally, here at the end, if you made it this far without rage quitting, let's address it all and our initial question. We asked, should RWBY fall in love? And honestly, at this point, it might surprise you, but I think my answer is no. Which may sound odd after how I just bigged up Jaune for ages. But while I love the potential there and I really think that could be amazing, at this point, narratively, I'm not sure if it's too late. And if it's something to bring up at this point in the story. You have Yang and Blake in a relationship on one side of the field. You have Nora and Ren in their relationship on the other side of the field. So honestly, starting a third romance angle would feel a bit stifling. It would feel like we are dominating this whole volume with just romance plots. And doing it after this volume feels really late, especially once we return to Remnant and the story has to keep going and we gotta keep saving the world. As for Jaune's development, which I would really like to see, I'd love that mature approach to come up, but it feels like we're not going that route. Just because the potential is there doesn't mean it seems like it's gonna happen. Jaune seems to be doing pretty fine now. We've basically just moved on from Pyrrha after the statue moment, and it seems like he'll be happy to just not address it ever. And ending up with either someone else, like it's an ending flash forward and it's someone we knew in passing, or random, like I don't know, he's with Neon or something, right? Or he dies in the ending, or we just see him doing missions and being a huntsman and we don't address his romantic endeavors. That just seems like what's more likely to happen. And then they don't have to address or moving on from Pyrrha, even though it's an interesting concept. Another big issue is that RWBY as a show has never really been about romance, and they've said that many times despite the audience's interest in romances. So having two running already is a lot of like story load, and it sounds like it's going to be more than enough when it's something they haven't really had much time to handle before. We don't even know how well they can handle it, so with two running already, adding a third might just be too much. And also, yeah, it's just that RWBY still has stuff to do. That is the nicer thing about the Jaune idea, is it can kind of open up along the way without detouring the plot much, but the Weiss one would feel token and the Oscar one really could derail the plot, and we have to continue with RWBY being the leader and the main character, to be the force that drives them all forward, to escape the island and stuff like Yang and Blake that happens on the side. And Jaune being here is likely just so he can perhaps get stronger, or he can deal with Pyrrha stuff on his own, or see her spirit or whatever, or get in just some new equipment maybe, you know, get a cool sword replacement and head back in to kill Cinder and continue his mission. While being the main character oftentimes meaning being kind of boring, it does play a role for RWBY. Also, them moving forward without just ever addressing RWBY's romantic interests mean they can avoid the issue that I'm hoping to avoid, which is the shipping wars breaking out. If they never say one way or the other, they don't piss off any of their very vocal audience who's interested in those elements. Basically, they never confirm anything, so they don't piss off anyone in particular, and no one turns against them, and no one starts throwing too much hate around, and it doesn't break out over the internet and give them a worse rep. So rather than damage their audience, they can just say RWBY stays on mission, and it's totally within in her character so far, so it doesn't seem off or like they're avoiding it. So far she hasn't shown any romantic interest, so if she just continues that way, it doesn't feel like they're avoiding the topic. Honestly, if I was to pick, I like the idea that RWBY decides to learn about what she wants and feels as an ending, so that we get the idea she has her next adventure, but it's more centered around herself as a person. That's very real, and that kind of life and death scenario she's on can force people to feel that way. I think a relationship would add some much needed dimensions to RWBY as a character if we're looking at her alone, but I don't know if those dimensions would fit on her while she's already on this path towards Salem and finding out about her mother and leading the team and all of that long story. So perhaps you're mad because now this feels like a waste of time, but my actual conclusion is no, I don't think RWBY should fall in love at this point. I would have maybe done it earlier, but where we're at now, simply how deep we are in the story, what other relationships we have happening at the same time, and the path we seem to have ahead, it doesn't seem like it's the best option. I do however think if they want her to fall in love, this will be the volume you'll start to see it. It either has to be this volume with thoughts of Oscar or whatever while she's away, or with Jaune while she's here alone with him, or at the very latest next time when she returns to Remnant and her feelings for Oscar probably have come to the surface. That's the only real times to do it, but we're already running very late. That's just what I see in front of us for the plot and the potential avenues that the characters would have. Before I leave, I wanted to reiterate there's nothing wrong with disagreeing with me on any of this, or loving your ships, or your headcanons, but please be nice to each other. If you love something, that's fantastic, but let others love what they love too. Rather than hate them for what they love, ignore them, leave them to be happy and enjoy what you love all on your own, and no one gets hurt. Similarly, if you love something so much you simply have to share it and you want others to love it too, all you can do is present the idea and hope they come to it themselves, because no one loves anything you force upon them, no matter how good you think it is. So please, be nice to each other, and I really hope to hear what you have to say in a civilized and respectful manner. But that really is all for now for this incredibly long video. I really hope we can remain civil in here and be a good example of what rational discussion can provide to this community as a whole. Until next time, my name is Rigger, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope I did alright.